There is nothing as symbolic as a door. It shuts to protect you and opens to give you much more. Everyone wants to succeed, not just count pennies. When life gets tough, I remember a few things. Difficulty and struggles are part of what life brings. Your strength comes from the support around you. A true friend believes in what you do, there to hold your hand through any weather. I found my partner, and we walked through doors together.
Diamond, your bank.
Welcome to the program. You're with Arise News in Nigeria's capital, Abuja. Ahead over the next 30 minutes, all the global headlines you need to know about. You're watching Arise News now, and I'm Folake Adesugba. Now, our top stories this hour: the White House fights back against accusations that the U.S. president has broken election campaign financing laws, insisting he's done nothing wrong. We assess another extraordinary day in U.S. politics. And Zimbabwe's High Court is to rule on Friday on a legal challenge to the country's presidential election. And with inflation running up more than 80,000% in Venezuela, the country is hit by an earthquake. We ask whether Venezuelans are in any shape to deal with a national disaster. We begin in the United States, where the White House is engaged in a limitation exercise after the legal setbacks involving two of President Trump's former associates. Paul Manafort, Donald Trump's former campaign manager, were convicted of 8 charges of bank and tax fraud. Mr. Manafort was appearing before a jury in Virginia as part of Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Then, in a completely separate legal case in New York, Donald Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, pleaded guilty to 8 charges, including campaign finance violations. And what's been seen as the most damaging element to come out, Mr. Cohen, who last year claimed he was prepared to take a bullet for Mr. Trump, seemed to implicate him when he said he acted at the direction of the candidate. And today, Mr. Cohen is said to be more than happy to speak to the inquiry into alleged collusion with Russia. His lawyer, Lanny Davis, said his client was ready to tell everything about Donald Trump that he knows, insisting he has knowledge of whether Donald Trump knew in advance about the computer hacking, which undermined his opponent, Hillary Clinton. Mr. Trump denies there was any collusion with Russia to get him elected. In his first reaction after Cohen's plea bargain, Mr. Trump wrote on Twitter, "If anyone is looking for a good lawyer, I would strongly suggest that you don't retain the services of Michael Cohen." Meanwhile, within the last couple of hours, White House spokesperson Sarah Huckabee Sanders said the president was in the clear, and not that she's not aware of conversations about a possible presidential pardon for Paul Manafort.
The Manafort case doesn't have anything to do with the president, doesn't have anything to do with his campaign, it doesn't have anything to do with the White House. I'm not aware of any conversations regarding that at all.
Thanks. The question that I also
Other than actually when he was asked by a news outlet earlier this week, and he said that he hadn't been thinking about it.
Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman Richard Burr says he followed the developments involving U.S. President Trump's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, with great interest. Cohen pleaded guilty to a series of felonies, including campaign finance violations that the lawyers said he carried out in coordination with Trump. Burr added that Cohen testified to the committee that he did not know in advance about a 2016 meeting at Trump Tower between members of Trump's inner circle and a Russian lawyer.
Followed today's reporting about Michael Cohen with great interest. He appears to be pleading guilty to very serious charges. However, we have no insight into any agreements he and his legal team have allegedly reached. followed today's reporting about Michael Cohen with great interest. He appears to be pleading guilty to very serious charges. However, we have no insight into any agreements he and his legal team have allegedly reached with the prosecutors in New York. What we can say is that we recently re-engaged Mr. Cohen and his team following press reports that suggested he had advanced knowledge of a June 16th meeting between campaign officials and a Russian lawyer at the Trump Tower. Mr. Cohen had testified before the committee that he was not aware of any meeting prior to this disclosure in the press last summer. As such, the committee inquired of Mr. Cohen's legal team as to whether Mr. Cohen stood by his testimony. They responded that he did stand by his testimony. We hope that today's developments in Mr. Cohen's plea agreement will not preclude him from an appearance before our committee as needed for ongoing investigation. Thank you.
Well, for more on that Michael Cohen plea deal and all the other issues facing President Trump, my colleague Charles Inyagolu crossed over live to the U.S. Capitol and spoke with our chief Washington correspondent, Eric Ham.
If this is their idea of damage control, it's not working because Michael Cohen actually has the president on tape where they are actually conspiring together to actually make these payments to these women. And so now I think it's a matter of how the president can mitigate the political fallout from this, because as we know, the DOJ, the Department of Justice, they do have a policy of not bringing charges against a sitting president. So clearly the president is secure from any legal ramifications. It's now the political ramifications that should concern him.
So, I mean, it is fair to say that this has been a bad day for the Trump presidency. I mean, what's been the reaction in Washington to all of this in terms of how it affects the president?
Well, what you're seeing right now is many of members of the president's own party are being asked about this issue because for the first time in U.S. history, you have a president, a sitting president, who is implicated in a crime. That automatically begins the thinking and the around the idea of potential impeachment proceedings. And so we are seeing many of the members of the president's own party trying to avoid the question or simply not answer the question. It is important to note, however, that many Democrats, many members of the opposition party, have actually called for a wait and see on the full investigation to get an idea of what Bob Mueller's investigation will provide. And so we are seeing caution. We are seeing members take a pause on this. Even potential presidential candidates in 2020 who might be running against this president are actually slamming the brakes on this idea of impeachment.
Eric, I'm trying to gauge the gravity of this allegation by Mr. Cohen for an international audience, because this is not the sort of thing one expects to happen to American presidents. In fact, I believe the last time a president was accused so directly of criminal behavior was Richard Nixon with Watergate some 45 years ago. And as you know, Watergate ended the career of President Nixon. Are there any parallels that you see here?
None at all, Charles. In fact, as I said just earlier, this is the first time that we've seen a president actually directly implicated in a such instance. And let's go back to that time. If you go back, we saw Nixon was just actually one of a string of presidents, one-term presidents. Before that, we saw Lyndon Johnson, who actually resigned over Vietnam. Prior to that, John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated. Richard Nixon, who then had to leave in disgrace. And so now, you know, I think many are wondering, is the United States now returning to that dark time where we will see people who have ascended to the highest office in the land actually only now walk away in disgrace as a result of this. And even though the president is dealing with so many legal and political ramifications, he continues to to execute his duties. We do know that the Supreme Court nomination is moving forward. The president is still continuing to engage in a massive trade war with a number of different countries. And so the president has a lot on his desk, both foreign and domestic, and he is attempting to continue to juggle all of this. The question is, how long can he keep this up?
President Donald Trump's national security advisor says the U.S. is not seeking to change the regime in Iran, but would want to see changes in its behavior. At a press conference in Jerusalem, John Bolton said the Iran nuclear deal helped the country's regime survive and build upon its activities in the region. He also warned Syrian authorities against using chemical weapons as government troops prepare to launch an assault in the Idlib province, the last remaining pocket of rebel fighters in the country. The advisor made the comment as he wrapped up a visit to Israel.
Just to be clear, regime change in Iran is not American policy. But what we want is massive change in the regime's behavior. And among other things, and the administration policy, which is across the board really, was articulated by Secretary of State Pompeo in a speech that he gave at the Heritage Foundation a few weeks after the president withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. The fact is that Iran's economy has been mismanaged for a long time, and that the effects of this mismanagement throughout the country have been known. The Iran nuclear deal mitigated the effects of its mismanagement of the economy and gave the regime new life, gave this regime that's been the central banker of international terrorism since 1979, new assets that it could use for its nuclear weapons program, for its ballistic missile program, for its terrorist support activities, for its conventional military activities. And we saw the consequences of the provision of these new resources in not reduced Iranian belligerency in the region after 2015, but increased Iranian belligerency in the region. We now see plans for the Syrian regime to resume offensive military activities in Idlib province. We are obviously concerned about the possibility that Assad may use chemical weapons again. We had hoped that our strikes had created structures of deterrence to convince the Assad regime not to do that. We hope that's right, but just so there's no confusion here, if the Syrian regime uses chemical weapons, we will respond very strongly. And they really ought to think about this a long time before they come to any decision, because there's no ambiguity in the U.S. position on this point. So this is a very delicate, very difficult situation in Syria, but one that we're not going to allow the Iranians to take advantage.
Away from that, American visitors to the Vatican have condemned recent allegations of child abuse by Catholic clergy in the United States of Pennsylvania. A Roman Catholic priest in Pennsylvania was charged on Tuesday with groping a 17-year-old girl and sending her nude images of himself just a week after a grand jury reported the church had covered up decades of child molestation by priests across the state. This is at least the second case of possible priest abuse being investigated in the Allentown diocese since the grand jury finished its report, which identified 301 predator priests in a half-dozen Pennsylvania dioceses, including 37 in Allentown, going back to the 1940s.
It's abominable. I mean, they should prosecute those people to the fullest of the law, and they have nothing to do with what's right about the church, and they should just be taken.
People have not been held accountable. They should be held accountable just like anybody else would be. It's really simple. The church knows too. They just haven't done anything enough about it. They're starting to move towards it, but there's no reason they should have any other protection than any other citizen. Any other citizen did the kind of stuff that those folks are accused of doing, they'd be prosecuted immediately, as they should be.
All right, time for a short break now, but do stay with us. Plenty more ahead, including a legal challenge to Zimbabwe's elections results. Details when we return.
Nigeria. We are 198 million productive people with over 900,000 square kilometers of fertile land. Nigeria's banking system has emerged strong and resilient from the 2016 crisis, which has enhanced our productivity in agribusiness and manufacturing. Come, invest in Nigeria's agribusiness, manufacturing, and value-added mining. Enjoy the Central Bank of Nigeria-led initiatives in funding interventions, stabilized exchange rate, friendly capital repatriation regime, and many more. The Central Bank of Nigeria's robust monetary policy and interventions under President Buhari's administration had positioned the economy to target and attain a GDP growth of 6% with a strong and growing external reserves. Come, invest in Nigeria. Nigeria, ready for business.
All right, welcome back to Rise News Now. We're live from Nigeria's capital, Abuja, and I'm Folake Adesugba. Now, Zimbabwe's Constitutional Court has been hearing the main opposition party's challenge to the results of the last month's historic presidential election. The opposition claims the vote had gross mathematical errors and it is seeking a fresh election or a declaration that their candidate, Nelson Chamisa, is the rightful winner. The election was the first after the fall of longtime leader Robert Mugabe, who stepped down in November. Many had hoped for a peaceful transition into a new era in Zimbabwe, but 2 days later, 6 people were killed when the military swept into the capital to disperse protesters.
The legal, the presidential court challenge that was put by the Movement for Democratic Change must be done fairly, transparently, and in accordance with the law, without favor or fear, because we need to move forward.
As I see, the results that will come out are not a true reflection of the judicial system. We have got a biased judicial system because already some of the candidates who contested as presidential candidates are being denied to present their issues.
Meanwhile, violent clashes have marred Eid celebrations in Indian-controlled Kashmir as anti-India protesters try to rally in the region's main city, Srinagar. Indian security forces fired tear gases and shotgun pellets to disperse the protesters. Anti-India sentiments run deep in Kashmir, a Himalayan territory divided between India and Pakistan, but claimed by both. In recent years, the Indian-controlled portion has been renewed rebel attacks and repeated public protests against Indian rule. Rebels have been fighting Indian control since 1989, demanding that the territory be united either under Pakistani rule or as an independent country. Meanwhile, Italian firefighters have released footage of emergency crews working near the remains of a collapsed bridge in the Italian city of Genoa. Now, it comes after the board of the private company that controls the bridge approved an initial 500 million euros in funding to help victims and finance a new steel bridge that it says can be ready in about 8 months. And now let's have a look at business news. U.S. stocks are on the verge of surpassing their longest running rally. It's now 3,453 days since the S&P 500 hit its low of 666 in March 2009. Since then, the broadest U.S. blue chip index has more than quadrupled in price terms, creeping within striking distance of its January all-time record and outpacing most rival major global indexes.
doing so, then the tables get reset to January 26th as the end of this bull market. We are still in a bull market because we have not declined by 20% or more on a closing basis. Yes, we have had at least 2 corrections since this bull market got started in March of 2009, meaning we've had declines of 16%, 19%, and then 14%. So yes, it's been a volatile ride, but we have remained in this uptrend, which we call a bull market. This market has worked its way higher, climbing a wall of worry. And as a result, I think that we're not likely to see the bull market come to a conclusion anytime soon. You need to look at both sides of the coin, inflation and valuations. Right now, adding those 2 items together, however, we are in the second most expensive bull market since World War II, second only to the bull market that ended when the tech.
For more on this and other business developments in the U.S., my colleague Charles Niagoli earlier spoke to correspondent Jade Parker, who gave this update.
Actually pretty mixed across the stock indices here. The Nasdaq rose about 0.4%, and that was on the strength of tech stocks. Meanwhile, the Dow lost about 0.3%, as those renewed political worries, as you said, surrounding President Trump sort of loomed large. Now, as you also mentioned, the S&P 500 was little changed, but it did mark its longest bull market run. As you said, that run has now stretched for 3,453 days, which is the longest streak by commonly used definitions. Now, taking a look at the individual sectors today, energy stocks rose more than 1% as oil prices jumped, while retailers gained from Target and Lowe's results. Target CEO Brian Cornell said that this is the best consumer environment he has ever seen, which is a pretty bold statement, and Target is benefiting from that. Another boost to the market today came from technology stocks, which advanced 0.4%. Overall, the legal woes of those 2 former advisors to Trump did contribute to investors' caution, though, and the market is not too bothered by these headlines, at least not yet. The release of the Federal Open Market Committee's minutes from its last policy meeting also only had a fleeting impact on Wall Street's major indices.
Now let's talk about the Federal Reserve, Jade. I understand it's released minutes from its last meeting in July. The outlook apparently getting somewhat dicier as people expect a rate hike in September. Tell us more about what those minutes revealed.
Yes, Charles, as you said, there are a couple of key headlines that came out of those minutes. Firstly, like you said, the US central bank is discussing raising interest rates again. And they're also examining how global trade disputes could pose a threat to the US economy. Now, let's delve into the interest rates first. So the Federal Reserve has been raising rates gradually since 2015, as you well know. And policymakers are now concerned the economy is so strong that inflation could rise persistently above the central bank's 2% target. So Fed officials held rates steady at this meeting, but their discussion left clear that they're considering another rate hike soon. Just as a reminder, the Fed has raised rates twice this year already. Policymakers also generally noted that spending by US households and businesses appear to have considerable momentum, according to the minutes. Now, the other interesting thing the minutes revealed is that policymakers held ample discussion about the risks to the economy from simmering trade tensions. The Trump administration has raised tariffs on imports from a range of countries, as we know, including China and members of the European Union, which has triggered a retaliatory tariffs on US exports. The discussion outlined the tough situation that the Fed could find itself in should the trade disputes worsen, with US businesses potentially needing to scale back hiring and consumers possibly facing higher prices on imported goods. Policymakers pointed out that a large, prolonged trade dispute could likely hit business sentiment, investment spending and employment. Wide-ranging tariff increases, on the other hand, would reduce the purchasing power of US households, according to the minutes. Don't forget, the Fed is tasked by law with fostering full employment and steady prices. The minutes also gave an indication the Fed was preparing to debate once again how best to implement its monetary policy.
And now let's take a look at the world of entertainment now. Hip-hop star Nicki Minaj has cancelled her North American tour with rapper Future. Minaj said on her Twitter account that she did not have enough time to rehearse for the upcoming Nicki Hendrix tour in September after the release of her latest album, Queen, which was released on the 10th of August. The rapper says she will contribute more rehearsal time toward the tour's European launch with Future in February. Minaj says her North American tour will be rescheduled for May next year. However, the tour will be without co-headliner Future due to scheduling conflicts. Now let's move over to sports. Thierry Henry is edging closer to securing a first managerial position after holding talks with French side Bordeaux. The former Arsenal striker and current Belgium assistant manager is understood to be enthusiastic at the prospect of working at the Ligue 1 club. Bordeaux, who played giant in Europa League qualifying playoffs on Thursday, sacked Gus Poyet last week after the Uruguayan branded the sale of his forward, Gaëtan Laborde, without his knowledge, a disgrace. Poyet was initially suspended and then dismissed after a brief meeting with club officials last Friday. And another French side, Lyon, has strengthened its squad, signing defender Jason Denayer from Manchester City. The 23-year-old made the move after he struggled to establish himself in Pep Guardiola's squad and spent last season on loan at Turkish side Galatasaray Lyon. Finished third in the league last season behind champions Paris Saint-Germain and AS Monaco, and currently sits in 10th place. All right, that's it for this edition of Arise News Now. Do stay with us, plenty more still ahead on the channel. I'm Folake Adesugba from the whole team here in Abuja and London. That's goodbye and thank you for watching.